You've tuned in to the unavailing frequency. But don't touch that dial. We've got you right where we want you.
This is Dead Reckoning Part 5, The Edge of the Map. I drove to New Haven on a Saturday in the second week of January. The drive is about 45 minutes from Hartford on I-91 South, a highway that runs along the Connecticut River for a stretch and then cuts inland through the kind of middle Connecticut geography that's neither dramatic nor dull, hills that are suggestions of hills, exit for towns you've heard of but never visited, water towers above tree lines, the accumulated ordinary infrastructure of a small state going about its business. I've driven it many times. I drove it that morning with the Navigon on and quiet, and I watched the blue arrow move south on the screen's gray map. I thought about what Claire had not said at Cole Park, and what she was going to say now, and whether or not I was ready. I decided somewhere in the nights between New Year and this Saturday that readiness was not the operative condition. Readiness implies a threshold that you cross, a point which you have accumulated enough information, enough courage, enough certainty, and then you can proceed. I'd learned in the months since October that thresholds don't work that way. You don't acclimate to them. You arrive at them in motion and cross them before stopping, because stopping was never really an option. The GPS had taught me this. You follow the route or you don't. And if you don't, the screen shows you that you're being watched, that this situation is real, that your hesitation has a cost. I no longer needed the camera to tell me this. I had internalized it the way you internalize the things that have been true about you for long enough. Not as a rule, but as a fact. Like the fact that you prefer one side of a bed, or that you always underestimate how long tasks take. I followed the routes. This was who I was now. I found Claire's house on Canner Street, a 2-story colonial painted gray-blue, well-maintained, a small front porch and a silver Camry in the driveway. She was waiting on the porch when I pulled up, which meant she'd heard me coming. The Civic's exhaust had developed a faint rattle in the cold, and I kept meaning to have it looked at. She was wearing a heavy cardigan over a flannel shirt and holding a mug, and she watched me park with the patient focus of someone who's been thinking about this moment for a long while. I got out. She said, "Thank you for coming." "You said soon." I said, "Yeah, I'm in it." Inside, the house had a quality of a person who thinks carefully and lives functionally. Books were organized by subject rather than aesthetic. A workbench in what should have been a dining room. Equipment I recognized as test and measurement gear mixed with equipment that I didn't recognize at all. A large monitor sat on a workbench, and it showed a waveform display, some kind of signal visualization, green lines of amplitude against time frozen mid-measurement. On the kitchen table were coffee, 2 mugs, and a manila folder. She poured, and we sat. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at me. "I told you everything I knew about the hardware," she said. "The secondary assembly, the detection mechanism, the learning correlator." "Yeah, you did." "Well, there's a component of the system that I didn't describe, because I wanted you to sit with the rest of it first. I wanted you to understand the function before I told you about the failure mode." "The failure mode?" I said. "The correlator learns," she said. "Every threshold events it observes, it refines the signature. After years of operations and dozens of events, the signature in the library, they become very precise, much more sensitive than Arsenault's original calibration, much better at detecting weak signals. Small distress, early stage distress, the first edge of a threshold long before the event itself. More sensitivity is generally better. You get more of a warning time. You can respond earlier, but..." I interrupted. It starts to detect things that aren't threshold events," I said. She looked at me. "How did you know?" "Because that's what happens when detectors get too sensitive. False positives, the signal to noise ratio degrades, You start detecting noise as signal. Yeah. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Not frequently and not randomly. The correlator's architecture limits the false positive rate by design. But in sufficiently evolved units that have been operative for several years and have been present at many events, the sensitivity reaches a point where the boundary between distress signal and background becomes unclear. So what's the background? What's the baseline? Well, that's the question, she said. The correlator is calibrated against a reference pattern that's derived from acute threshold limits and events. But in long-running events and units, this pattern has expanded, absorbed data from so many events it has edges that have grown wider. And at the widest edges, she stopped again. She picked up a folder, took out a printed graph, a waveform I couldn't read technically, but could read as a shape. A complex shape with a clear main feature, a long, low tail of secondary features fading toward the baseline. This is the signal from my unit, she said. Its current state. 14 months of operation, 47 events. She tapped the main feature. This is acute distress. Physical emergency, high magnitude, what the unit was built to detect. She moved her finger along the tail. And these secondary features, they're what the library has acquired over time. Lower magnitude signatures. Things that are in the family of distress but are not acute threshold events. What are they? She put the paper down. Loneliness, she said. Grief has become chronic. Long-term fear, the sustained low-level signal of a person who's not in immediate crisis but who is, she searched for the word, who's living below the threshold of their own capability, who've been in a kind of distress so long it just becomes their baseline. And so I sat with this. So your unit is routing you to those people, I asked. Occasionally, she said, not often. The magnitude's low enough that it usually doesn't break the detection threshold, but sometimes in the right conditions with the right proximity. Yeah, it routes me to people who are not completely in emergency, who are ordinary, human suffering. Long-term, low-grade, the kind that doesn't call 911, doesn't make the news, doesn't end up in anybody's records. I thought about the same man on the steps in New Year's Eve. His 2 days without sleep, his son's phone call, his Christmas lights across the street. So was my routing to that man a failure mode, I asked? Or was that intended? I don't know, she said. I genuinely don't know. Arsenault's notes, what Gerald preserved, what I've been able to piece together, they don't address this. I don't know if he anticipated the system would evolve in this way. I don't know if this is a drift from the design of, or if it's a fulfillment of it. She looked at her waveform. I've decided to assume it's a fulfillment. It's not a bug. That the expansion of sensitive range is the system becoming more itself, more responsive to the actual breadth of what distress is. But it seems like this bothers you, I said, or you wouldn't have told me to come before it routes me somewhere that I'm not ready for. She was quiet for a moment. In acute cases, the gas leaks, the accidents, Marcus on Route 44, you know what you're there for. The situation makes the task visible. You can call 911, administer glucogen, honk the horn. The action is clear even if the execution is hard. She paused. But in the extended distress cases, the task is not completely visible. You arrive and you find someone who's in pain in a way that doesn't have an obvious intervention. Someone whose pain is not an emergency, but it's real. It's producing a signal. It's called you to them. And what they need might be something that you can provide, or it might be something you can't. And the GPS won't tell you which. And you've been there? I said. Yeah, I've been there. Well, tell me about it then. She looked at her coffee. So 3 weeks ago, she said, the GPS routed me to an address in Fairhaven, a house. I arrived and I sat and nothing happened. No visible crisis. I was about to leave. I'd been there about 20 minutes when a woman came out of the house to put something in her recycling bin. She was in her 70s and she was alone. She paused. She looked at my car and I looked at her, and something, I don't know how to describe this as anything other than what it was. Something passed between us. Something like recognition. She asked if I was lost and I said I wasn't sure. She said I could come in for tea if I wanted to, and she stopped. I went in, she said. She lived alone. She'd been living alone for 4 years since her husband had died. She had children, grandchildren. They called on Sundays. The rest of the week she was alone in a house that she'd lived in for 38 years, and Claire's voice did not waver, but there was something in it, some texture. She was fine. She was managing. But eventually external measure produced that she was absolutely fine. But the signal in her body, it was producing something my unit had learned to recognize, that had routed me to her, and I sat in the kitchen for 2.5 hours, and I don't know what I gave her, if anything, but I just sat there and talked. Well, maybe that was it, I said. Maybe. But I couldn't know. I can't know. That's what I mean when I say it routes you to places that you might not be ready for. She looked at me. The acute events have a shape. You arrive, you either act or you don't. You leave and the shape of what happened is visible. These cases don't have that shape. They're open. You go in and you don't know when you're done, and if you've done anything at all, and you leave with that question unresolved. I thought about what that felt like. The man on the steps. I had left knowing if sitting with him had even made a difference. I told myself it was enough, and I believed that mostly. But Claire was describing the thing underneath the mostly, the persistent open question, the inability to close the loop. You said you wanted to tell me before it routes me somewhere that I'm not ready for. Is there something coming? Does your unit indicate something in mine? She nodded slowly. The mesh network, the unit-to-unit relay. Our units have been in proximity enough times in the past 2 weeks that they've shared state. My unit shows me a flag. It's a status indicator in the display data that I've learned to read. It indicates your unit has been accumulating signal from a persistent source, something that's been detecting and not rallying you to yet, because the magnitude keeps falling just below the threshold. She paused. But it's been building. Whatever it is, the distress has been increasing over the past several weeks. Where? Does it say? Well, I don't have the coordinates. A shared state doesn't include location data unless I'm in mesh range of your unit. I just know it's been flagged. And so when it crosses the threshold, it'll route me there? Yes, she said. I held my coffee mug. Outside through Claire's kitchen window, the January light was doing its gray flat thing over the New Haven street. The bare trees were doing their cracked glass thing against the sky, and everything was ordinary and still. Is there anything that would make me not ready for it? I asked. Or is this the kind of preparation where the thing you're preparing for is something that can't actually be prepared for? Claire looked at me. Yeah, it's the second one, she said. Well, then I'm glad you told me, because I was going to go anyway. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, yeah, I know. And something in her expression, the exhausted recognition, the same thing I'd seen in Ray's face in Colt Park, relaxed slightly. I just wanted you to know what it means. The GPS is sending you to these cases too, what it means about what the unit has become. So it means it's been with me long enough to learn what I'm near, I said. It means it's been calibrating against my specific life, my specific geography, my specific proximity. Yes, she said. It means whatever's been building, whatever the source is, it's someone I've been near enough, often enough, that the unit has flagged them specifically. Yes, Claire said. It's someone in your life. I drove home from New Haven with this sitting in the passenger seat next to me. Someone in my life. Someone whose distress had been building for weeks. Someone I'd been near enough for the detector to have measured, accumulated, and flagged. I tried to think about who I'd been near the past several weeks. I was at work, Dee, my mother on the phone, the neighbors in my buildings whose name I knew, whose faces I knew, whose lives I knew in a proximity, in the way you know people that you pass in the hall. I tried to think about people who, among those people, had been in pain, had been suffering, had been produced a signal below the threshold of a visible emergency. But the answer I had arrived at, I had been not arriving at for the entirety of the drive, because it was the answer I did not want. I thought about the Sunday calls with my mother that had been getting longer. Not longer in the way that good calls get longer, but longer in the way that calls are reluctant to end because ending means returning to something. I thought about the way that her voice had been lately. Not sad, not crying, not anything my conscious mind had flagged was wrong, but different. Slightly displaced from itself. The voice of someone who's keeping things in order through effort rather than ease. I thought about my parents' house, an hour northwest of Hartford, where my father had been working less and my mother had been home more. My brother was not coming home for Christmas. He told me in November, matter-of-factly, that he wasn't going to go to he was going to go to his girlfriend's house instead. And I said, of course, that made sense, without asking what this meant for our mother, who set 5 places at the table every year, who I knew had been cooking since November 28th. I thought about Christmas. I'd gone for 2 days, and my mother had been fine. She'd been performing fine, at least. But I now understood in the clear light of the 40-minute drive on I-91 with the Navigon quiet on the dash. She'd been performing fine with the practiced ease of a woman who'd been performing fine for long enough that she wasn't sure that she was herself, where the performance ended and where the reality began. And I thought about my father, who at the dinner table had talked about his projects, his woodworking, the table he was refinishing, who had not looked at my mother when she spoke, who had looked at his plate when I spoke about my new position, who had excused himself after dessert to watch something in another room, and who I told myself was just tired, was just getting older, was just quieter than they used to be. I thought about the signal, the body's honest broadcast. When I got home, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Ainsley, this is a surprise. It's a Saturday afternoon. What are you doing? I know. I was just thinking about you. There was a small pause on her end. That's so nice, sweetheart. Is everything okay? Yeah, everything's fine. How are you? Oh, same as always. The phrase of someone from whom same as always had become more loaded than it used to be. Your father's in the garage. I'm just sitting here. Just sitting here. My mother did not just sit. My mother cleaned or cooked or organized or read or gardened or made phone calls or did something. My mother sitting alone in her house on a Saturday afternoon with nothing active in her hands was not the same as always. Mom, I said. How are things with Dad? The pause this time was longer. It had a shape to it. Your father, he's been going through some things. Some feelings about getting older, about what comes next. We've been, let's just say it's been a few challenging months, how men are with certain kinds of conversations. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said with the voice of a woman who had said this word so many times it lost specific meaning and becomes a reflective response, a placeholder, the verbal equivalent of same as always. Mom, I'm gonna come see you. Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to do that. It's winter, the roads. I'll come next weekend. I'll stay a few days. Another pause, and in this pause, in the quality of its brief, complicated silence, I could hear something I should have been listening for months ago. A held breath, a small relaxation, the exhale of someone who'd been carrying something and has just been offered very gently a place to put it down. "That would be lovely," she said. Her voice had shifted, not dramatically, not tearfully, but it shifted. The performance loosened by a degree. Some layer of it dropped. "That would actually be really lovely, Ainsley." We talked for another 20 minutes. Nothing specific. Nothing that I could have pointed to and said there. That's the crisis. That's the threshold. It's just conversation. My mother's voice in my ear going slowly from its careful shape to something closer to its actual shape as the call went on. She talked about my father's winter moods and her own restlessness and the Christmas that had been quieter than she'd hoped for. She talked in the way of someone who doesn't talk enough, being given a space and not quite believing yet that it won't be taken away. When we hung up, the GPS said nothing. It was dark. The engine was off. The car was in the lot. But I looked at it through the window, the way I always did now. And I thought about the signal that had been accumulating for months for my mother across the distance between Hartford and her house. Across weeks of Sunday calls, the detector was patient and precise, noting the frequency, building the picture. I thought about Henry Arsenault, who identified the signal that human distress produces and had built something to hear it. I thought about how he would have felt, knowing that the system that he'd built had extended its hearing to include this, the low, persistent signal of an ordinary woman in an ordinary house having an ordinary, difficult year. Not a fire, not a car in a ditch, just a woman sitting alone on a Saturday afternoon, producing the quiet frequency of someone who needed to not be alone, and could not say so, and did not know how to ask. I thought about Elise Arsenault, who went into a Vermont lake without making a sound. I thought about all the ways that people go under without making a sound. I went to my parents' house the following Friday evening. I didn't tell my mother that I was coming because of this GPS, or because of Henry Arsenault, or because of a modified sensor array in the used car's navigation system that had been measuring her distress and routing me towards her. I told her I was coming because I'd been thinking about her, and that I wanted to see her, and I had the time. The drive was an hour, mostly of Route 44 West through the dark, familiar stretch. The trees, the hills, the narrow sky. I drove it the way I drove everything now. Alert, present, both hands on the wheel, and the night, and the way it had become since October, that was my default state now. The GPS was on and quiet. My father opened the door, and he was wearing his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a flannel shirt, and he looked at me with a mild, pleased surprise of a man who'd stopped expecting things and found the absence of expectations comfortable. "Ainsley, your mother didn't say you were coming today. I wanted it to be a surprise." And that was true. My mother appeared behind him in the hallway, and her face, when she saw me, did something that I hadn't seen it do in a long time. It simply opened. No preparation or performance, just the face of a woman who was seeing something she wanted to see. She hugged me in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, and I held on. "You look cold, dear. Come in." So I came in. The house was warm, and the smell of dinner that she'd been making, the winter squash soup that she'd mentioned on the phone weeks ago, finally had materialized. The Christmas decorations were still up in a reduced form. The tree gone, but the wreath on the door and the candles in the window were still there. The dining room table had 3 place sets, which was a small thing that was not a small thing. We ate dinner together. My father talked about the table he was refinishing, the particular challenges of the old finish, the grain of the wood. He was more present than he'd been at Christmas, or maybe I just thought he was, more paying attention to the texture of his presence rather than accepting its surface. He was a man in his early stages of fear of his own age, and I understood now. It wasn't depression or crisis, but the creeping recalibration of a person who for the first time had been encountering the early evidence that these conditions would not always be the way they were. It was a difficult thing to be in. It produced a quality of withdrawal that read as distance, but was actually closer to confusion. The confusion of a man who didn't have the vocabulary for what he was feeling, and therefore retreated to the task that he had vocabularies for, The woodworking, the projects, the garage. My mother knew all of this. She'd been managing it, absorbing it, holding the household's emotional weight while my father navigated his recalibration. She was doing this as she did most things, without saying much about it, without asking for help, with the assumption built in her generation's model of what women do that this was simply the condition of things. After dinner, my father went to his chair and his TV, and my mother and I did the dishes together, and this was where it happened. Not dramatically, not with tears or revelations, but the way real things happened, which is quietly, beside a sink, with your hands in warm water. She started to open up to me, to tell me things. Not everything, not the full 3D shape of it all, not all at once, but the outline. Her worry about my father, which had been present for 2 years, but it had intensified in the fall. Her own restlessness, which she describes as feeling like she was waiting for something without knowing what it was. The Christmas that felt too quiet, the house that felt too large, the weeks between my calls that had felt lonely, and lately, a kind of distance that she didn't know how to cross. "I don't want to make it sound worse than it is," she said. She was trying to pot carefully with the focused attention of people who are able to apply to objects when they're talking about themselves. "We're fine, your father and I. It's just a season. Everything's a season." "I know," I said. "I just sometimes..." She stopped, dried the pot, put it down. "I sometimes feel very far from people," she said. "Do you know what I mean? Like not lonely in a way that I could explain it to someone, just far, distant." "I know what you mean," I said. "Honey, you're busy with your own life, as you should be. And I don't want to be one of those mothers." "Mom," I said, "you can tell me when you feel distant." She looked at me sideways, the way she looks at things that she isn't sure that are true. "Can I?" "Yes." She was quiet for even longer. She handed me the pot to put away, and I knew where it went, always known where it went. She said, "I miss you. I know you're an hour away and we talk on Sundays, but I miss you when you used to be here, and then you're not here anymore. I never quit missing you. I never quite recalibrated to all this, I think. Is that just ridiculous?" No, Mom, it's not. It's just been 6 years since you moved out." "Some things don't recalibrate," I said. "Some things just stay the shape that they were." She looked at me. Her face in the kitchen light was the face of a mother, which is to say that a face that had been looking at me my whole life, which I suddenly saw clearly, as though for the first time, not as a background of my childhood, but as the face of a specific person. A woman of 61 years old who had been many things, was still being them, and was doing it much of the time without enough people nearby. "I'm going to come by more often, I promise. Not for any reason, but just to be present, just to be here." She looked at me for a moment, then she picked up the dish towel again and folded it over the handle in the precise way she always folded it, the way I'd watched her fold it for my entire life. "That would be good," she said, simply. The performance was entirely gone now. We finished the dishes and we sat at the kitchen table with tea, and we talked for 2 more hours. Not about anything serious mostly, just ordinary talk of a mom and daughter who'd always gotten along and who have for the past 6 years allowed the distance to make them lazy about that. To allow the Sunday calls to stand in for the kitchen table, the easy conversation, the kind that doesn't require setup or structure, that moves from a squash soup recipe to a book she was reading, to a woman at her church whose daughter was getting married, and that meant nothing and it meant everything at the same time, in the way that all the talk that constitutes a life shared with someone. My father came in at 10 to say goodnight. He looked at the two of us at the table and something crossed his face, something brief and unguarded that I recognized as relief. He said goodnight and went upstairs. My mother watched him go with an expression that was complicated and tender and tired, the expression of someone who loves a person whose difficulty they understand and have decided to keep choosing anyways. I stayed for 3 nights with them. On Sunday morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee, and the GPS, which was in the car in the driveway, turned on. I could see the screen from the kitchen window, the blue glow, the map. It stayed for approximately 30 seconds, showing the map, showing my blue arrow in my parents' driveway, and then it turned off. No route, no destination, no direction. Just the map showing me I was there. That's where I was, and then it went quiet. I thought about what Claire had said about the system's flag, the flag source, the accumulated signal, the distress that had been building below the threshold. I thought about the detector's sensitive range, the edges it had grown into, the lower magnitude signatures that it had learned to recognize. I thought about what it meant for the GPS that it turned on and shown me the map and then turned off without routing me anywhere. I thought it meant, you're already here. You don't need directions. You found this one yourself. I thought about Arsenault and what he had built, about a learning system that got better the more it encountered, about the edges of the signature expanding to include not just the sharp, acute emergencies, but the long, slow ones, the low signal of a person sitting alone in a too large house on a Saturday afternoon, too far from the people she loved to think of calling, about a system that had maybe finally done the thing that it was built to do in the deepest sense, not just detect the signal, not just to route the driver, but taught the driver to hear the signal themselves, without the GPS, without the route, just the residue of months of paying attention. It was left in me like a calibration, like a reference pattern derived from experience, like the correlated chip that learns. I poured the coffee. I brought 2 mugs to the table. My mother came downstairs in her bathrobe and sat across from me. We watched the winter light come through the window over the driveway where the Civic had sat with its screen dark, engine off, waiting for the next thing it was needed for. I want to tell you how this ends, and the honest answer is that it doesn't. Not in the way that story ends, with resolutions or closure, the shape of a completed thing. I still have the car, I still have the GPS, I still follow those routes. In March, I was at the house of a fire that had started in Windsor where a family had got out because I knocked on the door 90 seconds before the smoke alarm went off. The detector hadn't heard something in the house before the alarm did. In April, I was at a stretch of I-84 where a tire blown out had spin a minivan into a shoulder, and I was the first car there. The mother in the driver's seat was trying to get her child calm and her phone out simultaneously, and I held the phone and I called while she held her kid. In May, on a Tuesday evening, the GPS routed me to a park bench in Bushnell Park. A man was sitting there with a paper bag between his feet, the specific stillness of someone who's made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to act upon it. I sat on the bench beside him and I said nothing for a long time. Eventually I said, "Whatever you're thinking about doing, I'd like you not to." He looked at me. He said, "How did you know?" I said, "I just knew." We talked for 2 hours, and at the end of it, he called his brother. I drove home with my hands shaking so hard I had to sit in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I could go inside. I called Ray that night. He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I don't know, but I was there." "Yeah, that's enough." I called Claire and I told her about the park. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "The signature at that magnitude, the GPS shouldn't have been able to detect it from your commute distance. Your unit sensitivity must have increased significantly." I thought about this, about a detector that learned, about a system that became more itself the more it operated, about the correlation between distress encountered and distress detected, the feedback loop of a receiver that grew more sensitive the more it heard, about what it meant that I'd been driving this car for 7 months. I'd been near dozens of threshold events and had followed most of the routes, had been present as fully as I could manage at each of them. How sensitive will it get? "I don't know how sensitive it'll get," she said. Arsenal didn't set an upper bound as far as I could tell, or if he did, none of the units have reached it. I think the upper bound is theoretical. I think the ceiling is whatever the ceiling signal can carry. And what can the signal carry? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. In principle, any distress that the body produces at any magnitude. Another pause. In principle, a sufficiently sensitive receiver operating long enough, calibrated against enough events. She stopped. Could detect anything, I said. Could detect anything above the noise floor, she said. I sat with this, with the implications of it, which were large and also somehow not frightening, which were in fact something closer to the opposite of frightening, because the opposite of frightening is not comfort, not safety, not the absence of danger, but the opposite of frightening is meaning, purpose, belonging. A receiver that could hear any distress that the body produced, that grew more sensitive the more it listened, that was mounted in a used car sold by a man in a down vest on a Tuesday in October to a woman who was by every measure she'd applied to herself as unremarkable. And I thought about what unremarkable meant, about what it meant before and what it meant now. I thought about the bus route I used to take to work, the 2 transfers, the 15-minute walk. I thought about the hundreds of people that I had sat beside on that bus over 3 years. The faces I knew without knowing their names, whose bodies occupied the seat next to mine for 10-15 minutes at a stretch, whose lives I had no access to, had not sought access to, because this is what cities are. Proximities without penetration, nearness without knowledge. And I thought about all of them, about what sufficiently sensitive receivers might have heard, moving through all of them every day for 3 years. I thought about how many people produce a signal, how many people are between things or past things or afraid of what's coming, what's next. How many people are on bus routes at 7:15 in the morning, they're carrying something their faces don't show, their voices don't say, that broadcast unheard into the commuter air. I thought about Henry Arsenal on a dock in Vermont in 1991, about how the signal had been there, had always been there, but it found no receiver. I thought about 7 months of driving, about the learning correlator and its modified housing in the dash of a 2009 Honda Civic, about a detector that was calibrated now against my specific life, my specific geography, my specific routes, that had been measuring and refining and expanding day after day until the edges of what it could hear extended out to include the man on the bench, the woman on the steps, my mother in the kitchen, folding the dish towel in the precise way that she had always folded it, until the signal it was built to receive was not just acute emergencies, not just threshold events in the clinical sense, but the full spectrum of what it means for a human body to need something it doesn't have. There's a thing I've not told you, which I'm going to tell you now. In February, 3 weeks before the Windsor fire, the GPS routed me to a street in West Hartford that I didn't recognize. A residential street, older houses, the kind of block that had been the same for 40 years and will be the same for 40 more after. I arrived and set. There was nothing visible, no emergency or visible distress. The street was just empty. I was about to leave when a woman came out of the house and came across the street. She was carrying a box, the kind of box you use when you're packing up a room. Not a moving box, but a smaller one. A box that says small load or intermittent removal. She put it in the back of her car and she went back inside and came back with another box. I watched her make 4 trips, and on the 4th one, she stood by the back of her car for a moment with the box in her hand, not loading it, but just standing. Her back was to me, and she was holding the box. I got out of the car, across the street, and I said, "Can I help you with that?" She turned around. She was about my age, maybe a few years older. The careful blankness of someone in the middle of a very hard thing who's decided to get through it by not looking directly at it. But she looked at me. She looked at the box, and then she looked at me again. "I'm clearing out my mother's room," she said. "She died back in November." "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. She looked at the box in her hands. "I've been meaning to do this since November. I kept not being able to start it, and then today She stopped. "I just started." "Oh, that's gotta be really hard," I said. Yes, it's hard." She put the box in her car and she looked at the open trunk. My mom had a lot of things, small things. She collected them. Her voice was very clean. "I don't know what to do with these small things." I thought about the man on the steps and his son. I thought about the woman at the kitchen table who'd been alone all afternoon. I thought about what it means to be sent somewhere with no tool, no skill, no capacity for a specific task, and to have to find, in the absence of those things, the one thing you do have, which is to simply be there. "I've got an hour," I said, "if you want some help." She looked at me with the complete stillness of someone who's been in a hard thing alone for long enough that the offer of company has become something she doesn't know how to receive. It takes a moment, and then something in her face shifts, very slightly. It says, You don't have to do that." "I know," I said. We went inside, though. The room was her mother's room, organized, small, full of particular density of a life accumulated over decades in one place. Small ceramic figurines on the windowsill, a photograph on the nightstand, books with their spine arranged by color, which told me something specific and precise about her mother that I will not try to fully articulate, but it moved me. We packed boxes, we talked, after a while, first about the objects, then about her mother, then about other things, the sideways conversation that happens when two people are doing a physical task together, and the task creates a space that talking fills. Her name was Joanna. She worked in urban planning. Her mother had lived in this house for 30 years, had filled it with the small ceramic figurines from every country she'd visited on a teacher's salary, saving up for one trip every 2 or 3 years, bringing home one small thing from each place. "She's been to 37 countries," Joanna said, wrapping a figurine in newspaper. She was going to go to New Zealand in the spring. I didn't say anything. There wasn't really anything to say. We worked for an hour and a half, and when we were done, 3 boxes to donate, 2 to keep. The room cleared to a state that was still sad but manageable. We stood in the hallway outside the door, and Joanna looked at the room, and then she looked at me. "I don't know why you stopped," she said. "I was just driving by," I said. "People don't just stop." "Some do," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Thank you. I mean it. I've been trying to do this for 3 months. I couldn't have done it alone." "Well, you didn't have to," I said. I drove home afterward with the low winter sun in my mirrors. The GPS was quiet, and I thought about what the system was becoming, what I was becoming. As a function of what the system was becoming, the feedback loop, the more I went where I was sent, the more the detector learned. The more precisely it heard, the more I was sent, the more I went. The correlator and I were calibrating against one another, learning from the same events from opposite sides of the detection apparatus. The machine was becoming more like me, and I was becoming more like the machine. Both of us becoming slowly something that could hear and respond. And the last thing I want to tell you is the simplest. I've saved it because simple things need room. In April, on a Wednesday, I was driving to work on Asylum Avenue at 7:45 in the morning. The GPS was on. I wasn't following it. I knew the route. I didn't need the directions. The GPS said, "In 200 feet, turn left on Laurel Street." I turned left on Laurel Street. I didn't ask why. I didn't check the news. I didn't do calibration. Didn't run the mental query to see what might have been about to happen on Laurel Street. I just turned the way that you turn when a turn is the right turn, when your body knows before your mind catches up. There was nothing happening on Laurel Street. No fire, no accident, no visible emergency. A quiet residential block on a Wednesday morning. A few cars, a woman walking a dog, a man leaving the house with a coffee travel mug and a laptop bag. The GPS said, "In 300 feet, your destination is on the right." The destination was a coffee shop, small, independent. the kind with mismatched furnitures and a chalkboard menu. I'd not been there before. I parked and went in. I ordered some coffee. I stood at the counter and waited for it. I looked around at the shop and the mismatched furniture, the people on laptops, the chalkboard. And then I looked at the person at the corner table. She was maybe 70, small, white hair cut close, reading something on a tablet with reading glasses on the end of her nose. She had the quality of someone who occupies a space comfortably, who's been coming here long enough that the chair she's in is understood to be hers. She looked up from her tablet and she looked at me. She had bright, dark eyes that were, in that moment that she looked at me, doing the thing that old eyes do sometimes, evaluating precisely, without ceremony, who the person is in front of them. She said, "You look like you're looking for something." I thought about this and I said, "I'm starting to think I might be finding things instead." She considered this with seriousness that it deserved, which was a quality I appreciated immediately. She said, "Sit down then. You can find things seated as easily as you can standing." So I sat down. I don't know who she was. I don't know what the GPS detected, what signal brought me to that coffee shop on that morning. I don't know if it was a threshold even close to the clinical sense, a distress signal, a precursor to something, but I was there to prevent something, to redirect, or simply to witness. I know that we talked for 40 minutes and that she was a person, a specific, irreducible person with a mind that had accumulated something that I can call weight in the best sense, the weight of a life fully lived, fully inhabited. She talked about her work. She had been a research librarian for 30 years and was now retired. She talked about what she missed about it, which was the questions. People came to the library with all these questions, not answers. They came to find, but not to confirm, and that's a particular quality of attention that I miss. "What kind of questions did they have?" I asked. "Oh, every kind. The beautiful thing about a question is that it's honest. It admits its own incompleteness. A question says, 'I don't got this yet. I'm reaching for something.'" She looked at me over her reading glasses. I think most of the best things that we do are questions and not answers. Most of the best moments are those reaching moments. I thought about Henry Arsenault reaching for a signal that he believed was there. I thought about Gerald Fitch reaching for responsibility that only partially understood. I thought about Phil Kalowski and his down vest, and Ray with his 3 years and his canvas bag, Claire with her waveforms and her 14 months of thinking. I thought about a small girl in Vermont, a dock, the signal that everybody produces, the silence it met for 15 years until a man in his 60s in a Springfield trade show, with the patient urgency of someone who'd been waiting and waiting, found Gerald Fitch in a crowd. I thought about a question. What does distress sound like? And about a life spent finding the answer. "I know what you mean," I said. She looked at me and she said, "What are you reaching for?" I thought about this for a moment. The honest answer, the one that came without calculating or framing. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I think I'm learning to hear something that I couldn't hear before." She looked at me with those bright, evaluating eyes. She said, "That's the beginning of the most important things." I finished my coffee and I said goodbye and I left. Outside, the April air was cold and clear, the kind of clarity that follows winter, not the absence of cold, but the presence of something else alongside it, some light quality, some thinning of the gray. I got in the Civic. The GPS showed me the map, my blue arrow on Laurel Street pointing eastward toward Asylum, and the rest of the day, I sat for a moment. I thought about the woman in the coffee shop, what the GPS had detected in her, what signal had brought me to her door. A distress signal? The low magnitude frequency of an old woman in a coffee shop alone with her tablet, missing the questions? Maybe. Or maybe the detector had expanded further than Claire's framework could contain, had grown sensitive enough to detect not just distress, but its opposite, Not just what the body produces under the weight of crisis, but what it produces under the ordinary weight of wanting, of reaching, of being still after everything, in the posture of a question. Maybe Arsenault had built something that could hear both. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the signal that a body in extremis produces and the signal that the body in longing produces are, at the frequency of their deepest emissions, the same signal. The broadcast of a living thing encountering the edge of its own limits and asking into the air without expectation or certainty whether anyone is near enough to hear. I put the car in drive and I turned right on Asylum Avenue. The GPS said nothing. The blue arrow moves east toward the city, through the ordinary morning, through a map that was 11 years out of date and still knew the roads. And I drove the way I drove everywhere now. Both hands on the wheel, my attention extending outward, and some part of me tuned as best I could manage to the frequency, to what was around me. I listened, and I listen all the time. I still have the Civic. The AC compressor makes a sound like a cat that doesn't want to be picked up when it first starts in summer. The dent above the rear wheel well is still there. The stain on the passenger seat, the one that's shaped like Florida, it's not gotten any better or worse. The GPS is on the dashboard where it's always been. It boots with a blue globe and the 3 ascending chimes. The maps are outdated by 12 years now, going on 13. The CVS that closed years ago is still labeled as a CVS. The voice still sounds like someone reading a eulogy. I've stopped minding this. I've come to understand it as accuracy rather than effect. The voice of something that knows, that's always known, that the work it is doing is not trivial, that the routes it gives are the only kind of route that matters. Turn left. In 200 feet, your destination is on the right. You have arrived. Somewhere in a lake in Vermont, the water is cold and dark and still. The dock stands above it. The sky above the dock is full of stars that have been burning for longer than any human grief, longer than any human signal, longer than the time it took for one man to build a way to hear what had always been broadcasting. His daughter's name was Elise. She was 7 years old. She went into the water without making a sound. And because of what her father built, because of what he gave to Gerald Fitch in a Springfield trade show on a day neither of them would have described as significant, because of what Gerald gave to Phil and what Phil gave to me on a Tuesday in October in a gravel lot in Route 9, somewhere in the dark right now, someone is driving toward a sound they couldn't hear before. And someone is not alone.